I'm going to welcome Kelly Nee. She is one of our other forum organizers for the Climate Adaptation Forum. She's also executive director at Tetra Tech Ocean Science.
Good morning, everyone. We are gathered here this morning on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc, the original inhabitants and stewards of this land that we now know as Boston. We pay respect to the people of these tribes, both past and present. So, welcome to today's Climate Adaptation Forum. We have another in-person sellout this morning, and I'm so excited to see so many people in the room today. We're also very happy that we can continue to offer our virtual programming. And many thanks to Foley Hoag for providing us this beautiful space that makes that a fairly seamless experience for everyone, and to Weston and Sampson, who sponsors our virtual programming. It's really important to us that we can provide that high quality experience to both people that are in the room and people that are virtual. So as Anne said, make sure that you get your questions to the right people, and we will make sure that we are bouncing back and forth between in-person and virtual questions. A little bit of background about the CAF for those of you that might be a little bit newer to this forum. We are in our 9th year of programming, which is a little hard to believe at this point. Thank you, Nasser. To think about what we're going to do for our 10th anniversary next year. We cover a very broad range of topics, but all related to climate adaptation and climate resiliency. We are guided by a steering committee of 15 committed professionals. They are the ones that choose the topics that we cover every year, and they are the ones that volunteer to be the co-chairs of every event. In the room today with us, we have today's co-chairs, Beth Lambert, Joe Family, and Kyle Johnson. You guys want to give a little wave? We also have a couple of other current steering committee members, Indrani Ghosh, Julie Wormser, and I thought I saw Carolyn on the list, but I haven't seen her this morning, Carolyn Norkowitz. And we have a few alumni with us today, too. So welcome to Nasser Brahim, Deanna Moran, Rebecca Hertz. Great to see you guys in person. I do have a few thank yous I want to run through. First and foremost, thank you to the Environmental Business Council. Anne Geisinger, Jessamine Cox are on the organizing committee along with myself. Jackson Bailey and Stephanie Sikora out front make sure that everything runs seamlessly. I also want to thank the University of Massachusetts at Boston and the Sustainable Solutions Lab, and in particular, Gabriela Bocio Santos, who's also on our organizing committee. Takes a village to pull off these programs. We also have a number of sponsors and supporters that I would like to thank. Our sponsors provide financial support for the forum, and our supporters help us get the word out, help us get people in the room, help us get people in line. So thank you very much to everybody that helps us with that. Special thanks to Weston and Sampson. They do sponsor our virtual programming, and I'd like to invite Indrani up here to say a few words.
Thank you, Anne and Kelly, for opening the forum up today. And good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here and see this full house. And thank you all for joining and being part of this conversation today. Some of you who know me know that this topic today feels very especially personal to me right now. Just this week, my hometown of Kolkata, a 300-year-old city in India, has experienced devastating flooding from heavy rains. We were battered with flooding, with rain that fell over 7 inches of rain in 3 hours, with the city experiencing 10 inches in one day. Some unprecedented flooding, complete disrepair of infrastructure, communities, streets turned into flooding, turned into rivers, and breakdown of emergency services. And it has hit me really hard, because my mom has been in the midst of it as an elder living alone. And that's hit us hard. It's hit us hard. It's hit me personally very hard. And it's made me realize the importance of these conversations, how critical this conversation is today, because the policies and the regulations that we sometimes view as technical and bureaucratic are in fact some of the most critical and powerful tools that we have at our disposal to protect people, our ecosystems, and our communities. And today we're fortunate to be part of this forum to hear from our leaders from New Jersey, Cape Cod, Vermont, to hear about their experiences and how they're using and transforming rules to move into blueprints for resilience. A heartfelt thank you to EBC and the Sustainable Solutions Lab for organizing this forum, for Foley and Hoag for hosting us, for co-chairs Kyle, Beth, and Joe for putting this forum together, and of course, a sincere thanks to all the speakers for sharing your insights and experiences. I encourage you all to listen and ask questions, and most importantly, think about how we can use the lessons learned from what we are hearing today in our work. Thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Seth to say a few words.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. We love having the forum at Foley Hoag. It's a great series, and this particular topic, a firm of lawyers, is particularly relevant. I'll just say real quickly, it's the Climate Adaptation Forum, and you think about adaptation and resilience. And the way I would frame this conversation is resilience is not just about buildings, it's also about governance structures. If we don't adapt our governance structures, we won't be resilient. So with that, I'll turn it over to Beth Lambert to introduce the program.
Morning, everyone. I'm Beth Lambert. I'm the director of the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration, which is part of the Department of Fish and Game. And I'm here on behalf of the co-chairs to set the stage for today's forum. Thank you, Andrani, for your compelling remarks just now. I think you really explained well why regulations are so important and the importance of the regulatory environment as a tool as we face the changing climate. So today we'll be focusing on how states and local jurisdictions are building a regulatory framework that supports resilience and climate adaptation. This topic really rose to the top very quickly among the organizers of these forums. We were all thrilled and we couldn't wait to address this topic. That was our first reaction. Our second reaction was that we were like deer in the headlights, like, well, wait a minute, how do you update regulations in light of climate change? It's incredibly difficult to update land use and regulations for climate change because of the complex interplay of scientific uncertainty, unknown future conditions, and competing interests, among other factors. The good news, however, is that it is possible and people are doing it. And so that's why I and my co-chairs, Joe and Kyle, are incredibly excited to have today's speakers join us. The first presentation of the day will discuss New Jersey's comprehensive, first in the nation approach to updating state land use regulations. These updates are intended to support New Jersey communities, residents, businesses, and others in building resilience to sea level rise, extreme weather, and other impacts from climate change. Next, we'll hear from Vermont. Our presenter will discuss Vermont's new Flood Safety Act, which protects river corridors and supports climate adaptation activities, particularly activities that reduce flooding. And then lastly, we'll hear about policies and regulations to manage floodplain risk on Cape Cod. Thank you to our presenters for coming here today. I'm incredibly excited to hear from you and looking forward to all three of these presentations. Now I'm going to hand the microphone over to Kyle, who will be introducing the speakers.
Thank you. And thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Our first speaker today is the Commissioner of NJDEP, Sean LaTourette. He was appointed in June 2021 to this position by Governor Phil Murphy. He's responsible for formulating statewide environmental policy and is a Rutgers guy through and through, has gotten multiple degrees and has been a professor at Rutgers, has vast experience and deep commitment to equity and protecting vulnerable communities while facilitating public infrastructure development and advocating for environmental protection. He's also a twin dad, a self-appointed water nerd, and environmental policy pro, and he's a dogs and outdoors lover. Welcome, and thanks for being here.
Kyle, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. No. Y'all could do better than that. Good morning, everyone. All right. So first of all, my thanks to Beth for reaching out in the first instance to invite me to join you all up here in New England. I often have to remind myself that we don't get to claim ourselves a part of New England. But the Mid-Atlantic doesn't exactly want us either. So that gives you a sense of what it's like to be from New Jersey. I appreciate that introduction, Kyle. I've been working on the reforms I'm about to explain to you for the last 6 years. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done in my entire life, save being a dad to 14-year-old twin girls. So wish me luck on both accounts, if you will. So let's see if I can get this. Am I supposed to point this any particular place? No. Okay. All right. It's very good tech. Thank you to Foley Hoag for hosting this consortium. I'm really impressed that you have been doing this for 9 years in a dedicated space with professionals that are practitioners and those who are invested in climate adaptation in all the different ways you are. Congratulations on that. So I have been at the Department of Environmental Protection for going on 8 years. Prior to being the commissioner, I was the chief counsel for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And just a little bit of background for those of you here in New England. In our construct in New Jersey, we have a big umbrella approach to environmental governance. I was so excited to hear Seth mention governance. And that means that all of our environmental quality, our EPA-like features, our natural resource management apparatus, historical restoration and protection, fish and game, all of that and then our environmental infrastructure investment portfolio, as well as the state elements of what I'd call the proactive parts of FEMA, all sit within our Department of Environmental Protection in New Jersey, right? We have 8 sub-agencies within it, and that gives us an opportunity to drive policy as a through line across those multiple agencies. And while I'm here today to talk to you about our regulatory reforms, I wouldn't be able to do that without first sort of setting the stage as a matter of our experience of climate impacts in New Jersey. We thought it was really important as we began the work of integrating climate change science and considerations into our regulatory and financing programs. Began that work when Governor Phil Murphy took office in 2018. We had to aggregate, assimilate the global scientific information on climate change, add to it New Jersey specific studies, and make it granular and accessible to people in New Jersey so that it spoke to their lived experience of the places that they live, work, and learn and recreate. And so that, of course, took some time. We released in 2020 the New Jersey specific scientific report on climate change and have been updating it every other year or so with addenda. This year, we'll do a full rewrite to integrate all of those different addenda into a single report. But it served the basis, right, of our work to reform regulations. I'm going to primarily talk to you about flood risk, both coastal and inland, because that's a major concern and a driver of our regulatory reforms. Those certainly not the only risk or the only thing we're reforming regulation about. But in our state, we have a broad suite of environmental land use regulations that are implemented at the state level. That doesn't mean we control local land use. New Jersey is a home rule state. We have more municipalities than the state of California. It's awesome. Until it's not. Kyle knows something about this. And so But nonetheless, because of our environmentally sensitive areas that are regulated on a state level, we oversee about 25% of land use in the state that will require some type of state review because it's in a floodplain or because it's in it implicates a wetland, it's in a waterfront development area, or in our coastal zone, which has New Jersey specific regulations as well. And so these facts that you see on this slide here really kind of serve the basis of some of these actions, right? We've studied chronic inundation and extreme precipitation in New Jersey with scientific partners from Cornell and the Northeast Climate Center. We've studied sea level rise with a group of 20 scientists, some based out of Rutgers University in New Jersey, including Bob Kopp, who's a contributor to the IPCC. And so then we tried to determine how to take that information, take that scientific study and integrate it into our land use regulations on the state level, which then plug into local level. Now, primary in that work is the risk of sea level rise, which in New Jersey is 2 times greater than the global average, and the risk of extreme precipitation and chronic inundation. And all of this is part of our overall approach to climate policy in New Jersey. We look at it, at the top level, very simply. What's our job? Reduce and respond to climate change. How does that take shape? Well, in each of those 2 policy channels, we look at it as a 3-legged stool, right? Whether we're talking about emissions reduction in the reduce policy channel or in adaptation and resilience in the respond policy channel, there are 3 main elements that we work on. We work on the scientific study and directional thought leadership that creates the underlying basis for our regulatory and investment decisions. And then we invest ourselves in incentive structures that support the endpoints for emissions reduction or in the other channel, mitigation and resilience. And there are some examples of that on the screen. I won't go into detail. And then because all of the science and all of the planning and all of the directional statements in the world aren't written worth the paper they're written on without action through environmental governance, and because the market alone, and even with or without incentive structures, are not enough to do the thing. We must have supportive regulatory reform to connect that through line. And so we're working on those reforms in each of those channels. And in the mitigation channel, we call that CPR, climate pollution reduction, and we have a suite of regulatory reforms under that banner. And then on the resilience side, we call that resilient environments and landscapes, or REAL, because climate change is real and we need to do something about it. And so just an example of that directional thought leadership. I'm sure these slides will be made available. You could click on those tiles, you could read these reports. Most recent one this week that isn't on my slide that you could Google. We put out as this year's addition to the Climate Science Report, and a chapter on economic risk, right? The economic risks of climate change, which I often, because I spend my time in this space, think everybody knows, but apparently everyone doesn't. So we need to make sure that that is in a really aggregated and concise place for people to access. And so that report's on our website now. So what are we doing as a matter of regulatory reform? I think of this really simply, but I'll get into some detail. Right? We need to ensure that what we build today can stand the test of time amidst a changing climate. Right? Why do we need to do that? Well, it's the right thing to do. There's that. But it's also what the public that we serve expects. If, as has been the experience in New Jersey, people continue to endure flood event after flood event, the question is always, what are you, state government, local government, doing, right, to address this issue? Or more commonly, who didn't do their job well enough that I keep getting flooded out of my home, right? The expectation on the part of the public, the residents, the taxpayers, our neighbors, is that we are already doing these things, right? Not that we might do them or we're all squabbling about how to do them. The expectation is that they are being done. And so we looked at how we need to adopt our environmental governance to be more forward-looking, right? Because every single thing that we build, right, is informed by metrics that date back decades and decades ago, right? Flooding being a primary consideration in New Jersey, where, not unlike here in Massachusetts, right, we are coastal, we are very low-lying, right? And the way that the last ice age affected the landmass of New Jersey is different than up here, right? Only half of our state was covered with glacier, and as a function of that, the bottom half of our state is sinking, right? And so all of these considerations play together. In addition to that, New Jersey's an effective peninsula. We're bordered by the Atlantic Ocean on one side and one of the biggest rivers on the other, the Delaware River, that divides us from Pennsylvania. And we have many, many, many interior waterways. 15% of the state of New Jersey lies in a floodplain, a FEMA-designated floodplain. And that floodplain, as I would imagine folks in this room know, is calculated based on historical rainfall data between the years of 1899 and 1999, right? I couldn't sit at a bar and order a drink at the time of that last data point in 1999. And yet we use those estimates to inform the way we build our infrastructure, how and where we build our residential and commercial and industrial development. And we need to think about that differently. Why? Well, because this is our lived experience. My house is somewhere in that muck, right? Now, this is along the Raritan River in central New Jersey. Rutgers University would be just to your upper left past those high rises, right? And the right in the center is one of our major highways, right? And this was during the remnants of Tropical Storm Ida in 2021, which by the time it hit New Jersey was just a really bad thunderstorm, right? It wasn't a hurricane, right? Tropical depression that just happened to sit over us for 6 hours and dumped 10 or more inches of rain in some places, right? And so in the immediate aftermath of that storm, there were calls, as there always are, to do more by the public. And so our approach there was to take this reform, Resilient Environments and Landscapes, was meant to address all of our regulatory apparatus, and we split it in half. And we said, we're going to work on reform to our inland flood protection standards separate from our coastal flood protection standards. And in 2023, we enacted what we call the Inland Flood Protection Rule, which is based upon the scientific studies that we did with the Northeast Climate Center in order to determine how much extreme precipitation has increased in New Jersey since 1999, 2.5% to 10%. And that's not variability, that's geographic variability. Some places in New Jersey, it's 2.5% more. Some places it's 10% more. And when we project forward using a downscaling of reliable climate models, right? Yes, there's always noise in the science. No, we can't predict the future. No, science doesn't stand still. But we now know enough to do something. It is, in my view, professional malpractice on the part of all of us practitioners in this space, be it lawyer, engineering, so on and so forth, to not think about the fact that our landscape is being affected by these conditions and will continue to be affected by them, and they will worsen in the years ahead, regardless of our efforts to mitigate emissions, right? At least for the next 30 years. So we've got to do more to right-size these regulations consistent with the experience that we're having and that which we project. And so from that, we see that throughout the state of New Jersey, this is now split by counties, we're seeing 2.5 to 10% more extreme precipitation between currently today as compared to that historical FEMA model, right, Atlas 14. And when we project forward toward the end of the century, why the end of the century is 2025, right? When we build things, we want them to last for 75 years. Yes, no? Who lives in a home that's more than 75 years old? Raise your hand. Yeah, exactly. Who's crossed a bridge that's more than 75 years old? Okay, right? So, this idea that we're planning out to the end of the century in the state of New Jersey has caused, some consternation among the community of home builders and others. Not to disparage them or call them out. They're just like, well, why are we doing this? Why aren't we using the 30 years because that's what's in a mortgage? Well, why did we pick that number anyway? What, just because that's the 30-year mortgage? Why is that relevant? Right? Should we not be taking an asset-based approach to regulatory reform, where we look at what we're building and we ask ourselves, how long do we want it to last? And what are going to be the conditions during the life of that asset? And so we reformed our regulations to include this reality of flood risk as an inland basis. And what did that mean? It meant that in New Jersey, in our inland communities, there is now, both as a matter of determining flood jurisdiction, an additional factor of 2 feet on top of the existing FEMA baseline, right? So you take FEMA's base flood elevation in New Jersey, you add 2 feet, that's how you get your jurisdictional area, and that is your standard for your first livable floor in a residential development. Now, why do this on the state basis? In New Jersey, floodplains are administered on a statewide basis. Anyone who develops in the state of New Jersey in a floodplain has to comply with the state of New Jersey's Flood Hazard Area Control Act. The state gives permits for development in floodplains in New Jersey, not the local governments, right? Local governments ensure compliance as a building code matter with the NFIP, but we say where things can go and how they must be constructed in order to preserve safety, both as a matter of infrastructure and habitable buildings. And so that reform has gone into place and has been now our rules in the inland area for 2 years. So let's flip to the coastal side. So again, our reform was meant to be all one big package, and REAL now primarily as a flood risk matter focuses on the coastal zone and attempts to integrate sea level rise projection into our coastal flood hazard management program. And there's a suite of other changes within this reform as well. Everyone loves to remind me that it's 1,000 pages long, as if that is, yes, it's 1,000 pages long. Yes, that's a lot of pages. But as if that means that the requirements are so draconian that the number of pages itself means it's something we shouldn't do. The reason that it's so long is because we are, at the same time, we are working to integrate these considerations. We are also better streamlining the regulations themselves to make our administration of the permitting programs more efficient and quicker. Because you can indeed both experience the abundance agenda and address climate change. The two are not mutually exclusive. So we explored the risks to sea level rise increase in New Jersey over multiple years. Our first sea level rise study was in 2016. Then there was another one in 2019. There'll be another one by the end of this year as well that's out. We don't expect big dramatic changes with it. And what we did here was analyze the projections of sea level rise consistent with different emissions pathways, right? What if we are on a low emission scenario? We're not. What if we're on a moderate emissions scenario? Maybe. What if we're on a high emissions scenario? Yeah, we've pretty much taken that off the table as a global matter, hopefully. And so for at least the economic-led, market-led transition has taken that off the table. And so when we look at the moderate emission scenario and sea level rise risk in New Jersey, you get a range of outcomes that relate to the likelihood of that sea level rise will exceed a certain level, and that's what you see on the screen here. And we focused ourselves in on giving people more than a 50% chance of not being flooded. And I want to say that again. We picked the middle of the road, moderate emissions scenario, and the chance that people will not be flooded out of their buildings by sea level rise half the time, more than half the time. And so that resulted in a policy decision to pick what you see in the red column there, which is a residual risk a residual risk of up to 17% chance that it's worse than we are projecting. Why? Well, choosing the most conservative, most protective endpoint that has the least likelihood of occurrence is a non-starter in lots of different ways. Even choosing the moderate scenario that gives folks more than a 50% chance of withstanding the flood risk has still been controversial in certain New Jersey communities. And so if I've pissed everybody off, I think we might have found the right answer. So an example of what this means, this is Atlantic City, New Jersey. Anybody ever been there? All right, look at that. So this is Atlantic City today. It's Atlantic City with 2 feet of sea level rise, which is our projection for 2050. This is Atlantic City with 5 feet of sea level rise. And so what does that blue area mean, right? And what does the green area mean? The light blue does not mean permanently underwater. It means standing water on that parcel at least 2 times a day, every day, with the tides, right? It doesn't mean that will be 5 feet of sea level rise as experienced on that parcel because, of course, well, topography, right? And the green areas, that's where all the sewers back up. So that's fun. And so looking at this reality, which is a hard reality to look at, the question is, what do we do about it? Well, the response has been, just by some, nothing. Let's just keep going. Let's keep doing what we've always done. My grandmother would say, if you always do what you always done, you'll always get what you always got. And we've been getting flooded out, y'all. All right, so where have we found ourselves? Not unlike the inland rule, what you see here is that the greater risk of sea level rise, the greater risk of inundation, and the more we need to do about it in the coastal zone. And so what we ended up determining is that we need to set a standard between 4 and 5 feet above the base flood elevation in the coastal zone. The degree of regulatory treatment as a matter of implementation for types of buildings in the coastal zone are different, of course, because tidal action and coastal flooding behaves differently than our riverine flooding, which is very flashy, sits for a long time, and causes folks to not be able to escape buildings. Our tidal and coastal flooding does not function the same way, just, hydrodynamics. And so what are we now, where the point we are at now is this rule has been proposed. We expect it to be adopted by the end of this year. Some changes have been made in response to public comment and requests that we've received for clarification. Our initial approach was to add 5 feet above the base elevation. We're going down to 4 feet above the base elevation in response to commentary from coastal community leaders. Right, we have over 120 municipalities along the coast, many of whom have told us that they're comfortable with higher levels of risk. And so we are heeding their call in that respect. And we are integrating into the rule in our change on adoption that these numbers are updated every 5 years, consistent with our sea level rise study, right? Because we can no longer pretend that the future is static, right? That's what we've been doing. It's been the source of a lot of our problems. And so that's where we find ourselves in the state of New Jersey. There's a bunch of other changes in this reform, and it hasn't been easy. The pushback has been real, and the mis and disinformation that surrounds these things has surprised me. So I'll stop there. I think I'm supposed to take some questions, and I'm happy to do that. I thank you for your time and your attention, and I really applaud you for creating this forum.
Hello, that was a moment of suspense. If you have a question, please raise your hand in the room, and either I, Jessamine, will bring you the microphone, or our lovely intern, Abby, will bring you a microphone. We're each going to divide and conquer on one half of the room. Please make sure you wait until you have a microphone before you start talking, because our fantastic virtual participants can't hear you otherwise. So we'll kick things off in the room. I got eyes on Julie. I'm going to bring her a mic. Sorry, I'm stealing your half the room already, Abby.
Thank you so much. And boy, that was brilliant. My name is Julie Wormser. I'm the climate chief in Cambridge. The 2 pieces that you have in your regs are things that we've been talking about since Sandy. One is pegging regs to the end of the life cycle of a project, not the beginning. And the second is indexing regs automatically to updated data. Those are the only 2 things that work fast enough to keep up with how rapidly conditions are changing. So God bless. And my question is, when I think about the changes in our precipitation, it feels like we're either going into a Mediterranean or a monsoon climate. That's different than just kind of pegging levels. It's like a different strategy, and wondering how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a really great point. One point about our climate experience in New Jersey, or our experience of climate impacts. We're a water-rich state, right? Peninsula, multiple inland waterways, obviously the Atlantic Ocean, Delaware Bay. Most of our rivers are tidal, right? So this is an important consideration for us. Direct answer to your question is there are considerations relative to storm surge in particular within the rule framework that I didn't get into that I could certainly follow up with you about and point out. But one of the things that's really interesting, and I think makes a change like this hard for folks on the local level or developers, not all, just some, have some concern about is, well, they don't see us getting flooded every day. They don't see sea level rise happening every day. And what we're seeing in New Jersey are this pendulum that is quite wild, where we have these periods of kind of like bomb droughts, right, that are interspersed with precipitation bombs, and then you get these prolonged dry periods that tax our water supply, and then dry out our our aquifers, and of course our soil column. And then when you get the bursts of extreme precipitation, it's like everything's falling on concrete or blacktop. And even though it's hitting the ground, it's rolling. So our infrastructure isn't big enough, right? And so we've got to think about every piece of that. And this regulatory reform does that in a bunch of other ways, with recharge, with stormwater, with retention, that I didn't get into.
Go for it, Abby.
Thank you. That was a fabulous presentation. My name is Bala. I work at the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. Right up front, you said you have two big buckets, reduce and respond. So this is sort of a high-level question. How do you integrate the two from a regulatory point of view? Do you deal with trade-offs between the two?
You can't. You have to do both. If you're not working in both columns, if you're not working in both columns, you're worsening one or the other. You have to work in both columns. I think, I just spent the entire week in Manhattan for Climate Week, and talking mostly about mitigation policy, starting to talk more about adaptation and resilience in Climate Week, which I'm happy to see. But we could turn off every natural gas fired power plant in New Jersey tomorrow. We can't, right? And we need more because we're in an energy deficit. We could make every electric vehicle on the road in New Jersey, or every vehicle on the road electric in New Jersey tomorrow, and we should. We could do all of that and the conditions still worsen for the next 30 years, right? At a minimum, just because of the way the carbon cycle functions, right? And the way that, we're dealing with the effective emissions, that were emitted, in the 80s, a lost decade to get climate under control. We failed. So we have to do both, because what we are projecting only gets worse if you don't work in the first column, right? So the integration is important, but what is integrated is that acknowledgement that it's not a choice, it's both.
Thank you. Bud Riss from the Green Ribbon Commission. You mentioned in your remarks that not only are you setting these new standards for precipitation and sea level rise, but you're also streamlining the regulatory process. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And then if I can sneak in a second question.
I'm a good governance nut, and I always want things to be more efficient and faster. You would be hard pressed to find an environment secretary in this country that does not believe in permitting reform and is not doing something to achieve it. The issue with permit reform, when people talk about it broadly, well, it's not what you think it is, right? Reform means investing in government capacity, in information technology infrastructure. And so we are streamlining the regulatory scheme in anticipation of capacity and IT improvement, both of which we're seeing, but not enough of. The streamlining in particular, we've got multiple environmental land use related codes, one for wetlands, one for waterfront, one for CAFRA, bringing them into a greater parity with one another, right, creates more efficiencies from a project development perspective, because you're not getting competing interpretations between programs and staff implementation, which can create log jams, as any practitioner, I think, has experienced in their career. In addition to that, we have multiplicity of types of permits in our construct: general permits, individual permits, permits by certification, permits by rule. We're truncating them down into a tighter set of categories, and we're making a lot of things available to just register online, quick and easy, where you don't need an in-depth technical review by staff. So, because we do floodplain management, you're building a gazebo in your backyard, right? That is not something that needs to take up time in the permitting queue in the way that a new train station or transit-oriented development in a floodplain would.
We do have a virtual question from Jim Reardon, who is asking about the 75-year planning horizon for infrastructure designs. Some agreement here that the mortgage term is unrelated to the useful life of infrastructure, but just a question on how it came to that number. Was it anecdotal or is there some statistical analysis?
Looking at the age of building stock and infrastructure that exists in New Jersey, right? It doesn't sort of come out of nowhere, right? Most of our buildings in New Jersey are the median is between the median is around 62 years, right? And that includes our real old development and our much newer development. And then looking from an infrastructure perspective at the lifespan, both in the transportation space, in the water infrastructure space, and trying to shed ourselves from attaching it to a financing period.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. Can I get some hands? I saw Nasser first. Sorry, Rebecca.
Thank you. Nasser Brahim, Mystic River Watershed Association. Let's say that New Jersey had really great maps that were projecting coastal flood risk out to 2070 or 2100, really excellent maps. Let's say we didn't have that for riverine flooding. Would that prevent you from maybe like moving first on coastal while waiting to get the science better on riverine?
Well, I mean, we have the science on riverine now, and we're just doing the mapping ourselves, right? I think sort of everybody's been like waiting for Godot with the federal government updating Atlas 14. And so we just figured we wouldn't wait, and we'd work on doing it ourselves. Not every single watershed that we regulate to has a defined FEMA map, but we're still able to do our own through the methods that have long been in our Flood Hazard Area Control Act in New Jersey. We've been doing this since the 60s, and I think it sort of puts us in from a statewide floodplain management perspective. So I think that is a distinction that we have vis-a-vis some other states that might not do it on a statewide basis.
I was hypothetically asking because Massachusetts has those great maps for coastal, but not precip, and now
you can still do it.
You can still do it?
Yes.
Okay, I just don't want to put you in the position of telling Massachusetts what to do, but thank you.
Massachusetts, you should do it. It's hard, right? Not impossible.
All right, thank you. So we will have Commissioner LaTourette back for our panel discussion later in today's program, but let's give him a round of applause. That was fantastic.
All right. So our next speaker is Lauren Oates, the Director of External Affairs in Vermont with the Nature Conservancy, and previously worked with the State Hazard Mitigation Program in Vermont. In her current role, Lauren works with partners and key decision makers to advance nature-based policy and programmatic solutions. She's especially interested in initiatives that support climate adaptation, flood resilience, biodiversity, and has worked in the spaces of freshwater systems, riparian systems, watershed health, and trails. Welcome.
Thank you. And also thanks for doing the digging on the bio. I definitely forgot to send one. So that was well done on your part. We'll get into it in a little bit, actually, so I can speak a little bit more about why an NGO is here to talk about state policy. Let's see. Harnessing the power of disaster. Oh, that's right. There's one up there. Beautiful. First, thank you to the forum hosts and sponsors. I think I speak for probably almost, if not all of us, that 9 months into 2025, it feels incredible to have an opportunity to talk about policy and regulatory success. So thank you for hosting. I hope that we can all learn from one another a little better. There you go. we all kind of need this moment. So I usually, when I present, only have pictures. I like to riff. And then I heard that we wanted to post these, and it wouldn't be that helpful if you just had a bunch of pictures of flood devastation in Vermont. So there will be words. I probably will not follow them, but hopefully they can be helpful for you. But general flow will be for me to talk about the problem of a non-coastal state with respect to climate adaptation, the attempts that Vermont has taken to solve it, especially over the past 15 years, the straw that finally broke our back into action, and where we're going from here. But first, a little about me, why I want to talk about myself. One, I forgot to send a bio. Two, I have spent my entire career thus far working on essentially what this legislation I'm going to speak to today accomplished. Professional faux pas, I am from Florida. I usually don't like to admit that, but it feels relevant here because I grew up in a place very familiar with natural disasters. I grew up in hurricane parties, which I think was my family's way of like preventing emotional trauma with respect to hurricanes. So they were always quite fun. Long power outages, lots of water, lots of wind damage, etc. But I also grew up in Florida, which is a place whose unofficial state motto is pave it, don't save it. Their ability to adapt to a changing climate, especially sea level rise, storm surge, is pretty bad right now. They're converting pretty much all of their wetlands except for the Everglades. So that kind of set in stone for me, and a deep interest in natural disasters, in climate-driven worsening of those disasters, and how we're going to respond to and create resilient communities. Too soon. Good. All right. From Florida, got out of Florida as soon as I could, moved up the East Coast, stopping in a couple states along the way. I was in between my master's and my PhD. I took a year off because I was sick of the lab. And I moved to Vermont to do a year of AmeriCorps to help the town of Waterbury recover from Tropical Storm Irene. And in that year, my whole life vision was changed. I watched what applied climate adaptation meant on the ground. I met community members who told me their repeated stories of flood damage and how they were scared to live in their homes. And I decided, well, I don't really want to be in a lab anymore anyway. I'm just going to do this, and I want to stay in government. I moved to state government. I became the Vermont State Hazard Mitigation Officer, so I know a lot about the NFIP, a lot about FEMA, and all of the pains therein. And then after 5 or 6 years doing that, mostly I was just frustrated with the lack of policy progress and how nothing seemed to really move the needle in the way that we had all hoped, despite spending tens of millions, billions of dollars on climate adaptation work in Vermont, and moved to the Nature Conservancy to try to affect policy change. So the problem, there are a lot of problems. First, zooming out from this beautiful state and that beautiful ocean over there, I live in an inland state. There is no coast, unless you count Lake Champlain. I live in the quintessential part of New England. We will adopt New Jersey today, where we have historic settlement pattern problems. We had to live near the river. It helped us move logging materials. It helped us with commerce. It helped us power textile mills, grist mills, all of those things. But it also meant that we built way too close to the river. And that's not just a Vermont problem. That's pretty much up and down the East Coast. What is worse for Vermont and the northern New England states or Western Mass is we're a little more topographically challenged. So where all that water comes off of the mountains down into our river valleys very quickly has created some pretty devastating events for our villages that are tucked in right there. The second part of the problem is climate change itself. New England, the Northeast, in general, as we know, is getting both warmer and wetter. And the wetness in New England is not coming in more rainy days over the course of the year. It's coming in more hazardous, big rainfall events, just more of those per year that add up to a wetter climate. And also the problem part 2A. We also have drought problems, which I took a screenshot yesterday from the drought monitor. Northern New England is dry right now, which is not a place that we're used to. And yet we know through climate models that the water cycle volatility is going up with climate change. We're going to get more frequent floods interspersed by more frequent droughts, which is a really weird problem to have. And it necessitates nature-based solutions more than ever to both hold more water on the landscape when we don't want it and to keep more water on the landscape when we need it. The problem part 3. We talked a lot about floodplains and storm surge. What we have not yet talked about was river corridors, and those speak to, again, that topographic challenge that we have in mountainous states. Floodplains, we'll talk about the FEMA problem, NFIP in a moment. About 20% of Vermont's damages happen in our floodplains. Floodplains are like bathtub style flooding. You saw a picture in New Brunswick, New Jersey. A lot of water, it comes up slowly, it stays for a little while, recedes slowly, and you have a lot of property damage, but the damage is like you got wet. The structures are still there, they are wet, you have to do an immense amount of work to recover from it. I'm not minimizing it at all, but riverine, river corridor flooding is very different, and it accounts for 80% of damages in Vermont. And that is where, if you see 2 of those pictures, the historic photo and the one at the very top of the house, is where a river jumps its bank and cuts a new course entirely. There's too much water, way too much erosive energy, nowhere for it to go because we've dredged and straightened our rivers for so long that it has to go somewhere to release that energy. And often it is right next to our homes and our power plants and all of the things that we have put right next to our rivers. And that is a big problem. Those are exceptionally dangerous, exceptionally expensive events that we have, and they happen pretty much every time it rains a lot. Not this year, luckily, because we had a couple really bad years lately. But the river corridor it's where we focus a lot of our energy, and unfortunately, it is a hazard that FEMA does not recognize. Which gets me to part 3A and B. River corridor versus floodplain. In this image, which I hope you all can see, are both the FEMA mapped floodplain in red and the Vermont mapped river corridor. Remember, the river corridor, I like to call it x-axis flooding. It's where the river is going to move along the x-axis horizontally. Floodplain, y-axis, how high it's going to go. Where's it going to fill? You can see in here a lot of overlap. It's the same river, but it is a different problem. In the first image, you see a purple arrow. It is pointing to a Vermont State Police Barracks, and exceptionally important in a disaster. It is located outside of our floodplain. FEMA, when that was permitted, didn't recognize it as a risk because it is outside of their map floodplain. It's a little close, but a map is a map is a map. However, it is solidly within the area that the river will move itself. It is exceptionally vulnerable to river corridor flooding, and it makes the entire town and community exceptionally vulnerable because those are our first responders. The other problem, this is a little harder to see. I hope you all can see it. The second image, again, red floodplain, yellow river corridor. The river moves over time. So that little arrow is pointing to the river. The floodplain doesn't even cover the river in that place because the floodplain map is static. So this doesn't even capture floodplain risk, let alone river corridor risk. And you can find places like that all over Vermont. Both of those incredibly dangerous places to live or put important infrastructure buildings. And yet, if you were just looking at the FEMA maps, which is what most people understand and do, they would build there. And let's not forget part 4. We are in Boston. This is an image of the Boston Tea Party. While we're not going to talk too much about taxation without representation, representation itself, we've talked about home rule. We've talked about adapting our governance structure. Seth, wherever you are, I really appreciated that. We have to adapt our governance structures. New England, Vermont is like, depending on who you ask, 250 to 272 towns, and they get full purview. We don't have statewide NFIP management. And most of those towns, Vermont is very rural, are like 2,000 people or fewer. We have like towns that have like 12 people. That's not a joke or a hyperbole. And that creates significant vulnerability for the people that live there and the businesses that are there. because a small town cannot manage all that is required by FEMA, and they certainly cannot then understand river corridor science and riverine damage. This is a text slide. This is hard for me. If you want to read it, you can read it. But basically, this is talking about how our regulatory landscape in Vermont has left our communities vulnerable. It talks about floodplains and how floodplains are actually managed by FEMA and how FEMA doesn't recognize river corridors and how our towns don't really enforce. That's a question I have for you later, Sean. Like, are your towns actually enforcing? That's very difficult for small towns to enforce. And then on the other side is the river corridor problem. They are mapped by our state. Only a third of our rivers are actually mapped. Those are the big, like 2 square mile drainage rivers. So the small upland tributaries that are immensely volatile in a high precipitation event are not mapped. We just have a standard buffer that we use to say, like, call this the river corridor, try to stay away. But we don't actually regulate them. We just say, hey, please don't build there. That's not a good idea, but we can't prevent you from doing that. 10% of our towns have adopted local river corridor bylaws. And they've done that, and we'll talk about it in a minute, largely because of state-based incentives, not because of a recognition of risk. The state-run buildings, owned, leased, we do usually follow river corridor guidelines and do not build our state facilities there. VSP, the Vermont State Police Barracks, was before all of that, so that's an exception to the rule. And then this long text is about something that you can read about, but I put this in for legislators to kind of explain to them, like, this is how hard it is for our towns to navigate our patchwork regulatory landscape. It is a nightmare. When I was the state hazard mitigation officer, I worked with nearly every single town in the state, and none of them could navigate all of this. It was disastrous for them, and it was disastrous for their communities. So here are the things that we've tried, especially since Tropical Storm Irene. Compelling via the public narrative. Did you know that it is not safe to live in a river corridor? You might consider living somewhere else, and here's why. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. Disaster recovery incentives. In Vermont, we have something called the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, that anytime we have a FEMA declared disaster, normally a certain percentage comes in from FEMA, 75%. 25% is required locally. 25% we then split between state and locals. Depending on the regulations that the local government wants to implement and enforce, we shift that scale up to more state coverage and less local tax burden. That was pretty successful right after Irene. We were able to get 10% of towns to adopt local bylaws for river corridor regulations. But it kind of stopped after that. It was like not enough to get people to get on board. 10%, nothing to snuff at, but it didn't keep going up. We really plateaued quickly. So then we said, well, what about a public grant edge? Everyone in Vermont loves FEMA hazard mitigation money. We used to. It was a lot of money that was available after disasters. I heard some sighs, and that we said, if your town has adopted the local bylaws for river corridor protections, we will give you a competitive edge to get more money from FEMA. We had pretty competitive rounds for the money, so oftentimes that would be like the deciding factor. If you are a town that has decided to make your community safer, we will give you money to continue to do that, and not in the communities where if we give you money for a buyout of a house and then you build right next to it in the same place, we're just going to keep spending money in your community without actually reducing risk. That helped a little bit. Again, trapped at 10%. And then we just did like the classic. Our Department of Environmental Conservation, Vermont Emergency Management, local NGO partners have tried for years and years and years to go to farmers markets, which feels very Vermont, with flume tables to show what the risk is of building next to a river. We've done webinars, we've done all of the things, and it wasn't enough. At that point in time, it was like, we need state regulation in a state that doesn't like that. We don't like that. These towns know best. Until in 2023, our state capital, where I live, flooded really badly, July 10th, after a very, very wet spring. Our dam that's just upstream of us was nearly about to breach. So it was about to be a lot worse, but we had about 5.5 feet of water fill into our floodplain in Montpelier. It did not get to the steps of the State House, but it got pretty close. And I think the photos of like, hey, the people who work in this building, the water is about to crash on your steps. What are you going to do about it? This is inundation flooding. There was a lot of river corridor damage too. But I think year after year after year of these floods, over tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars, which isn't a lot for a state like Mass or New Jersey. It's a lot for a small state like Vermont that does not have a large budget. Having to recover from these events is like breaking our back. So it was the moment to say, hey, now's the time. Let's go, legislators. This is not a bipartisan problem. This is something that affects all of your communities. I've been trying to pass this law for many, many, many years. And never waste a good disaster is like a saying that sounds really bad, and yet it's true. You have to move quickly after a disaster to move regulation. Otherwise, it's a dry year this year. If I were to go into the State House and talk about it, they'd be like, we're talking about wells that aren't working anymore because there's not enough water. Like, it wouldn't have worked this year. So we moved quickly, and we were able to pass the Vermont Flood Safety Act with bipartisan support. That bill has a lot of provisions in it. Get to those in a second. But the main, like the beautiful part of that bill is the river corridor regulations statewide. That in the next few years, once we get through education and outreach and mapping to determine like, well, we have these village centers. The river's already highly managed there. You're going to continue to manage it in that place. Can't we still develop in those places instead of going up into the hills and creating other problems? Yes, but let's map it and say where you can and cannot. If you are outside of the settlement area, you can no longer develop in the river corridor overnight, right? Like in 2028, when that permit goes live, you will no longer be able to do that. And that is something that I expected a tremendous amount of pushback from the development community. And I got none of my testimony. And I'll talk about why that is in a minute. But yeah, there's a mapping effort that says where you're allowed to develop and where you aren't, generally. There will be exceptions. That all shakes down in rulemaking, which is like the bread and butter of state regulation. So we're keeping a close eye on that process. 2-year education and outreach effort, and additional FTEs or state staff to actually implement, regulate, and enforce. But also some other really cool things in the bill that I'm not really going to talk about, but if there are questions, I can answer them in decreasing knowledge. First, wetlands net gain. There's a wetlands provision in the Flood Safety Act that says if you develop in a wetland, and there are different classes of wetlands, ones that you're not allowed to develop no matter what, and ones that you're maybe can with a permit, you have to, as a developer, find another wetland area to restore in the same watershed at twice the acreage. Because we have a lost trend of wetlands in the state, and wetlands are our sponges, and we need them for flood and drought resilience. So now if you convert a wetland, you have to find 2 times more to restore within the state or within the same watershed. New Jersey, I might get some notes from you. Statewide minimum floodplain standard. We're talking about doing that. A lot of towns have adopted local bylaws that say +1 BFE, +2, +3. It makes it really hard for our limited state staff to like go to a town and have to look through their bylaws, remember if they're where they are. So they're saying, we know it's a problem. We know it's going to get worse. Let's create a minimum standard and just put it for every single town that is in the NFIP, followed by also New Jersey, statewide NFIP regulation. There's a legislative committee underway right now to assess the feasibility of doing that. Again, our towns cannot manage FEMA bureaucracy. It's way too hard. This would help them immensely. We'll see where that goes. Dam safety. We've got a dam problem in New England. Over 14,000 dams are like destroying our rivers and worsening our floodplains and killing aquatic habitat, et cetera, et cetera. And we recognize that through this law, give some more money to dam safety engineers in the state, do some things with who actually manages and owns the dams that I can't speak to, so don't ask me questions about it. And then finally, dock foam. Somebody was interested in removing dock foam from our lakes and rivers. and that passed. So that's great. No more dock foam. So we love that for water quality. You know, when it floods, they break down and makes the water quality worse. So it got in somehow. What I want to talk about is what we did differently. I am from an NGO. The environmental community in Vermont is pretty codependent, as I call us. We're very insular, and we believe that everyone will care about the things that we care about. And so we can just stand on those merits and say, like, wetlands are important, protect river corridors, aquatic habitat, all those things I just said. Most people don't care about that. Or if they do, it's like Maslow's hierarchy, like way, way down. And so what we did differently, TNC, largely through like all of the connections I had from the state, was like, let's work with the people that actually are going to help us move this ball. The regional planning commissions. We don't have county government. They are our best friends. They are the ones that help towns manage all of this. They were on board and testified in support of this. And even more importantly, Vermont League of Cities and Towns, who essentially is like an organization that exists to protect municipal rights from the state. So like this would be face value, no, like we're taking state regulation, putting it statewide, taking the power away from municipalities. They came in and said, towns can't do this anymore. You need to take it over. That was huge. And when I was talking to my environmental partners, they were like, why would we talk to them? Like, we got wetlands and rivers. And I'm like, no, we got towns. We have tax burden and administrative burden. And that is what people are compelled by. We also did some public opinion polling because regulation at the state scale is like incredibly onerous and just scary. It sounds scary to Vermonters. And I think probably people across the country writ large. We spent some money to do public opinion polling before the bill was released to say, like, how do we feel about climate change, Vermonters? How do we feel about river flooding? How do we feel about a lot of different things related to it? And then at the end, how would you feel if the state regulated these river corridors and reduced your tax burden, made your communities both up and downstream safer, and let your municipalities actually like focus on your schools and your roads and those things that every time there's a disaster, they're left off to the side? And 2/3 of Vermonters were like, yeah, no, I want that. 2/3 like might not sound that impressive, but our pollsters were like, we've never seen any number this high for a regulation ever. So we were able to go to legislators and the governor's office and say, like, Vermonters want this. You have coverage. You can pass this legislation and the majority of your constituents will support it. And that was huge. We changed our messaging. That says it's the economy, stupid, overplayed, but true. Instead of talking about all the things that we love about nature-based solutions and aquatic and terrestrial habitat, we talked a lot about the fact that living in these places is not affordable. 3 minutes. Living in these places is not affordable, actually. We call it affordable housing because the land along river is cheaper. That is because it is more dangerous. And if you live there, you will have higher NFIP premiums. You're more likely to have your house ripped off its foundation from the river. It is not affordable. We put most of our vulnerable housing there. It is unfair, and we're not going to do that anymore. We talked a lot about social contracts. Remember those? Social contracts about like, hey, what you would do in your town directly impacts the town downstream. So if the town downstream is trying everything they can, they're restoring wetlands, they're protecting the river corridor, they're doing like +5 BFE in their village, and you just keep putting more and more fill against your river, straightening and narrowing and forcing all that water downstream, that's like not okay, right? Rivers are inherently intermunicipal. It's not fair that we regulate them town to town. And then finally, we led with stories. You know, when I started my testimony in the State House, I talked about the homeowners that I met when I worked for the state. Andrani, you shared a story, like it's so compelling when decision makers that have to respond to you listen to the stories of their constituents, people crying about like their terror of every time it rains, like this is not hyperbole again, all the time. We really wanted to focus those voices, both in webinars, all those things, farmers markets, but especially in the State House. I have like 1 minute left. So essentially we want to, this is again Montpelier. You see the river down in the left-hand corner. That is a very straight river. That is not what rivers are supposed to look like. We are trying to make living along river in a topographically challenged state better. And hopefully in doing so, We'll have more places that look like this, that store all that water in places that are not developed, and they keep that water from hitting our towns. And with that, I guess I answer questions and leave some more pictures of flood ravaged Vermont for you.
Thank you. We have time now for a couple of questions before we take a break. And Kyla, I think we're going to start with that virtual question you got.
Sure. So we have a question that came from Joanna Nadeau at Weston and Sampson. The question is around seeing the potential to combine outreach around river corridor rule with information and possibilities, potentially gauging interest on mid to long-term relocation and managed retreat. Just seeing a crossover opportunity. I guess the question is, with that outreach, is there opportunities to gauge interest?
I love that question because at TNC, we're investing a lot of our resources actually in the education and outreach. In statute, the education and outreach section is like, you got to tell these certain interest groups that the regulations are changing. And that's like all it says. You got to tell them the regulations are changing. There's no opportunity when you're going out to all those groups to talk about all of the things that I just talked about, the importance of river corridor versus floodplain distinction, how rivers move over time, like really get these towns that are going to have to navigate this new regulatory landscape to understand why this is happening and that it's actually a very good thing. And in doing that, expanding the education and outreach scope to broader conversations around climate adaptation and what it's like to live along rivers in Vermont.
Great, thank you.
I don't get to call on you, but I see you.
I'm coming. I guess you don't need to introduce yourself.
This is going to sound like a technocratic question,
Love
but
it.
I think I'm confused by the use of the term river corridor.
Okay.
How is that defined as coming off the floodplain? Because as I'm looking at your maps, I'm like, well, isn't that the floodway and that the flood fringe? Is what you're calling a river corridor actually the flood fringe?
No.
Or is it something larger?
So the FEMA floodway is like the most disastrous area within the floodplain.
Where the water typically runs.
Where the water typically actually runs. Still, it's based on inundation mapping. River corridor, if you look at this image, if you were to draw lines on either side of the widest part of that bend, plus a little more, is the scientific area that over time, the river will oxbow and cut and move. So instead of it just filling in that wetland, it will just cut a new course. And you can see river scarring all over the landscape across this country.
Okay. I think I'm getting it. In our parlance, in our regs, we should talk about this. We call it a riparian area. So you have hundreds of feet off of it, right? Which is the same as your river corridor. It's fascinating.
It's a little different, but we can talk technocratically. Yeah. Okay. But I'm
fascinated.
It's related. We've been trying to figure out how to communicate it. Like, it's the meander belt of the river. And we're like, what does that mean? It's again, a problem, and a problem that even FEMA doesn't recognize. So, but we should talk about it. I'm sure that New Jersey has river corridors despite being flatter.
Hi, my name is Jess from Niche Engineering. It's just a follow-up actually on that conversation we're having. Is that state mapped, and what's this kind of like data and who created that?
It's
mapping?
State mapped. Yep. And again, it's only for about a third of our larger streams and rivers, and it's mapped by our Department of Environmental Conservation.
And when was that mapping done?
It started in 2015, and this law now, and there have been a couple of like micro updates. This law now will require its update based on any changes that we've seen. Largely, it like depends on like how much erosion in an area. If there's bedrock, it won't really move, those kinds of things. Plus the infill mapping areas within settlements, like you can still build here and here's why. So that's theoretically, those are supposed to go live in January of 2026. It's not gonna happen, but it'll be very soon thereafter, like hopefully like summertime.
Rebecca, I skipped you last time, so I'm not this time.
Thanks, Jessamine. You talked about with your messaging, talking more about the economy and financial challenges. Did you also talk about financial benefits of these changes? Are there ways that you've been like, I feel like we often are very much like risk avoided, watch out, it's going to be bad. We can make it maybe a little less bad, but I think it's more compelling if we're like, actually, it will be great. So I'm wondering how you had a positive.
We did both, but we definitely leaned in heavily on the negative. Like, hey, we're spending way too much money and this will help us get away with that. But we also have a lot of examples of towns that have bought out like entire reaches of river and created really lovely like floodplain parks that have brought in people and the community and tourists alike and talked about the benefits of that. Benefits like the FEMA BCA, about benefit cost analysis of like nature-based solutions and how much money that will save you over time. That's still kind of negative, but a little on the positive. But I think people in Vermont, again, with a really strapped state budget, were way more compelled by the negative budget implications.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. I'm Rebecca Hurst from the Green Ribbon Commission.
Sorry, it may be quick. So I heard you say that the rulemaking prohibits any new development in these river corridors. So are these, get back to the definition here, is this upland floodplain area that where people previously were building, presumably, and they will no longer be able to has all value been removed from those lands? I guess I'm just thinking regulatory taking.
Yeah, no, I love the technocratic questions. No. So I mentioned that in statute, one, again, it's only a third of our rivers. Two, there are exemptions for our existing settlements, which is a term in statute that is very vague, which makes me a little worried, admittedly, about rulemaking, because once you open up a rule, you can change anything you want, and exemptions can start coming in all left field, right field, anywhere else, different ballgame entirely. So there are places, because we're managing those rivers so heavily already, that we recognize like we're not going to make all of our people move upland. Like that's disastrous too. It's safe-ish to build in these areas because we're managing them so heavily. If you are outside of an existing settlement for 5,500 miles of river, you no longer can develop. 67,000 hectares. I can't do the math right now, but it's a lot of acres. Like that land is now protected. And that was part of our narrative shift. Like the Nature Conservancy really cares about protecting river corridors. What this bill does is actually protects Vermonters from the rivers, and like protecting the river corridor itself is a co-benefit. But people can still develop. We still want compact settlement. We just want to do it in a safer way.
Thank you, Lauren. Lots of great questions. I see more hands, but we, as a reminder, will have a panel discussion towards the end of the program. So we'll take some more questions then. At this point in time, I'm going to turn things over to EBC's Executive Director, Anne, once again, and she is going to take us into a break.
We are going to move on to our next presenter. I just wanted to bring us all back, warn the Zoom folks that we are going to be getting back into the conversation and starting with the sort of second half of our program. So with that, I think Kyle's going to do the introductions.
All right, so our third speaker is Heather McElroy, a planner at the Cape Cod Commission, working to develop appropriate tools and policies to address the region's natural resource and land use challenges. Her work has contributed to many regional projects, including improving communication, knowledge, and action on natural resource and climate change issues on Cape Cod, ranging from the regional planning we'll be talking about today, low-lying routes analysis, green infrastructure, coastal resilience, and ocean planning. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. All right, let's see. So, oh, okay, just a little delay. So yeah, we're gonna, amazing to follow these two really dynamic speakers. I'm not sure I'm gonna keep up, but I'm gonna do my best. And we're gonna bring things down from sort of the state level to the regional level. So I suspect most of you are familiar with where Cape Cod is in Massachusetts. But Cape Cod, just for those who are less familiar, there may be people from away attending today. Cape Cod is made up of 15 individual towns, and individual towns who are fiercely independent but we very much identify as a region and work together as a region. So I work for the Cape Cod Commission, which is the regional planning agency on Cape Cod. It was created by a special act of the state legislature in 1990. So we are one of 2 RPAs in Massachusetts that actually have both planning and regulatory authority, which we'll get into in a little bit. So on Cape Cod, we have over 500 miles of shoreline, and the potential damage from coastal storms to impact our homes and businesses is really great, estimated in tens of billions of dollars of property value within our floodplain areas. So just to set a little bit of our regulatory context here, we were very fortunate to have the Wetlands Protection Act here in Massachusetts. It protects wetland resource areas, which we can regulate. There are also wetland regulations that DEP, our State Department of Environmental Protection, has promulgated. And they set those performance standards by which we can regulate certain activities. Our towns can also adopt bylaws and regulations, which is part of what we're going to talk about today. Those wetlands bylaws and regulations need to be more restrictive than the state act. The bylaws, importantly, need to be adopted at town meeting, which can be a difficult task. Regulations that might be adopted to address wetlands issues can be adopted by the Conservation Commission. So certainly a public process is required, but often the community sees that as an easier route to actually affecting some kind of regulatory change. Also relevant to this conversation is, and regulating development within the floodplain, is the Mass State Building Code. So in contrast to the Wetlands Protection Act, which enables communities to adopt regulations that are more restrictive, you cannot adopt local regulations that vary from the state building code, as much as some communities might want to do that. However, the bylaws and regulations that we adopt can be designed in such a way to ensure that we're addressing resource protection. And that's how the model bylaws that I'm going to talk about were designed. So the floodplain, or in Massachusetts, also known as land subject to coastal storm flowage, or LSCSF, it's a protected resource area. But there are no or few regulations that specifically address this at the present time. And also, importantly, the regulations that do exist consider just the FEMA designated floodplain. They don't look at future risk areas. So I'm sure everyone here in this room is very familiar with the fact that the state has issued draft LSCSF regulations. They're not yet promulgated. Actually, the Commissioner Bonnie Heupel, was at Cape Cod's One Cape conference last week, and she indicated that if she had her way, they might be promulgated by the end of the year, which would really be terrific. There's a lot of interest in this area, and there has been on Cape Cod a lot of interest in protecting the floodplain for several years now, and longer than that, I'm sure, but actually interest in doing something about it. So we heard from a lot of our communities that they wanted some, specific things that they wanted to be able to do within the floodplain. They wanted stricter standards. They wanted to address channelization. They wanted to make sure they were allowing for natural sediment transport and natural resource migration. They wanted to be able to regulate future flood resource areas. And they wanted to be able to regulate things differently depending on the level of risk or the sub areas within the floodplain. So we, the Cape Cod Commission, hearing these concerns, applied for and received a Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy Environmental Affairs Planning Assistance Grant in 2019. And that proposal allowed us to develop a model coastal resiliency bylaw that addresses many of these interests that were identified. And specifically, it incorporates elements that allow us to regulate a future floodplain using the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. More or less simultaneously, our sort of sister county agency, the Cape Cod Cooperative Extension, also WHOI, our Woods Hole Sea Grant program, had embarked on updating zoning bylaws to help our communities become current with the NFIP standards. Part of that effort, led by Shannon Hulst, the county's floodplain specialist, and she'll be joining us a little bit later for the panel discussion. Part of what she wanted to do was introduce sort of optional higher standards into that zoning bylaw work. So these two things were sort of going concurrently, not entirely in sync, but we rectified that when we pursued our next grant. So we had worked directly with communities to, we had 5 partner communities on that first bylaw project. And by the time we'd finished it, they were like, yes, this is great, but we also want regulations. So the next grant application we applied for, also from EEA, a planning assistance grant, enabled us to sort of pull all of these various tools together. The project was called Regulatory Tools for Coastal Floodplain Resiliency. We were going to build off of that model coastal resiliency bylaw, wetlands bylaw that we had developed, brought in the cooperative extension Woods Hole Sea Grant to align their model zoning bylaw with this other bylaw, again, looking at that, being able to regulate the future floodplain as sort of one of those key elements of it. And then also develop regulations that specifically address the community's interests in the kinds of things that they wanted to be able to regulate. You know, being able to get people to secure their stairs and their outdoor furniture and their patio accoutrement, et cetera, and as well as the other, you know, interests such as allowing for resource migration, et cetera. So there were a number of tools that we did as part of that work, which I'll touch on in a moment, but just want to explain for a moment about the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. This was a tool that we had become aware of and knew that we would be able to reference it as or hoped, and we were successful with our consulting team to use that as a tool that allowed us to regulate a future floodplain area. So the model indicates the likelihood of future flooding. It's using data sources such as sea level rise projections, historic storm data, landform, and others, and provides specific outputs such as projections of future flooding, the likelihood of future flooding at 2030, 2050, or 2070 time horizons, as well as flood inundation depths, as well as other outputs. So we built a viewer to help our communities understand sort of the implications of regulating to a future floodplain area. This the viewer here shows the FEMA sub areas. The green is the V zone, the blue, the coastal A, and the light blue, the A zone. And then the blue here, the dark blue, is showing the 2050 projection for flooding in this part of the Cape, with the homes that would be potentially affected shown in red. So, very simply, briefly here, our coastal resiliency regulations establish performance standards for development within LSCSF or the floodplain. And it expands our jurisdiction beyond the LSCSF or the FEMA floodplain to an area that we've identified as the coastal resilience zone. So you have the potential to regulate within that area, and the bylaw is designed to allow communities to, it's sort of a la carte. They can determine which future time horizon do they want to regulate to, 2030 or less, not recommended because that's imminent, 2050 or 2070. So based on their sort of comfort level with what they think their community can stand. And then also to regulate slightly differently based on the different sub areas. So things are very restrictive in the V zone, for example, and become less so as you go landward. So I think most people are probably familiar with this graphic, which helps illustrate DEP's new proposed sub areas, V zone, A zone, with coastal A and A being subcomponents of the A zone, also known as the MOA and the MIWA. We also sort of are working to help translate those ideas so that people can visualize what these different areas look like on the ground. I'll say we haven't quite perfected that yet. And so this is another shot of our viewer. Again, we wanted communities to be able to, both at the staff level, be able to understand what they're trying to promote, but also use as a communication tool with their constituents. So this again is showing flood extent, and it will show the 2050 and the 2070 extents. Another view within this data viewer shows the flood depths. So some of the other tools developed through that, that second grant that I touched on was a communications toolkit. Again, talking about these issues, even on Cape Cod, where you think everyone is intimately connected with the ocean and familiar with the tides and thinking about sea level rise. It's just not happening, especially also in a place where we have so many people from away. There are people who come from the Midwest and just don't know what the ocean does, really. It was really important to develop a toolkit that helps our communities, our nonprofits, anyone who's wanting to help move these regulations forward, communicate well and consistently across the region. So key terms are defined, that there are a list of best practices. Within the grant period, we developed some very town-specific data and information that's included, and talking points. It's really a great resource, and I would highly recommend folks who are in the area of trying to communicate regulation changes or other things. You could use the toolkit as a framework to translate for your own needs. A separate project but related was our flood area design guidelines. This was initially started as an effort to address our many, many historic structures on Cape Cod, which are a key part of our character and why people come to the Cape. How do we preserve those historic structures in the face of rising sea levels and flood risk without too much loss of character? So the design guidelines address different design considerations at different actual flood levels, and at the property scale and at the neighborhood scale. They're super interesting and very relevant beyond just historic structures. So now just switching gears a little bit, and I guess I'm getting close to my time, aren't I? So the Cape Cod Regional Policy Plan is a document that sets forth goals and objectives in a number of issue areas for Cape Cod as a region. It is the overriding plan that helps guide the development of other planning efforts, including in the recent past, the Climate Action Plan. We're in the midst of a policy plan update, and the comment period on our draft just closed this week. So we'll be looking to make any final tweaks to that. But what we wanted to do was make sure that the regional policy plan was in alignment with these model bylaws and regulations. It doesn't usually work this way. We usually like to lead with the regional policy plan, and the local guidelines, regulations should follow from that. In all fairness, actually, the RPP was not far off, but we wanted all of these things to work together so that hopefully as our communities adopt regulations, they're in alignment with the regional policies, which are applied occasionally to projects that the Cape Cod Commission regulates. So not only does it serve as a planning document and guide to our communities, it is a regulatory tool that sets forth the standards by which we regulate development. And very relevant at the present time, as there are a number of projects around the Cape that are proposing redevelopment within the floodplain. So the proposed language aligns with the bylaws. It limits or discourages new development in flood hazard areas. There are some exceptions, and there are also allowances for development in activity centers or in maritime areas, which are defined areas on the Cape. And it accommodates migration of wetland resources. So to date, probably like, who all's adopted this? Well, I can't say definitively anyone has adopted our model regulations yet, but they are working hard on it. So some of those challenges to model adoption have to do with a lot of staff turnover, actually. That's going to happen naturally, but also within the period of these projects, there was more staff turnover than typical. There's also commission turnover, local conservation commission turnover, and you really need a strong leader and champions to make changes like these. I think there's legitimate concern about being the first out of the gate, towns not wanting to take on something that's, really different from what other towns are doing. There's also been talk about sort of the strategy. Should we adopt the bylaw, which requires that higher level of approval at town meeting for most of our Cape communities? Or do we go first the regulations route, adopt some of the regulations that we know we can move the ball forward, get people more understanding how we're going to regulate and deal with the bylaw later and advance things more in a second step. So different communities have different strategies around that. There's also some communities who may not even go this far because they're concerned about the impact these regulations might have on their community. And then funding is an issue as well. So just very briefly, Wellfleet, they started with a coastal resiliency bylaw several years ago now, which is similar to, but a little bit different from the model bylaw that we developed. But they really, kudos to them to have taken that on. Yarmouth adopted a version of our model bylaw, much reduced, does not look at the future floodplain. Mashpee similarly has, they had been in conversations about adopting a buffer, a bigger buffer to their resource areas, and adopted something that is more similar to the model bylaw, but addressing development in the floodplain. Eastham is very interested in these regulations. I think they're also very interested to see that the state promulgates those regulations. Our Pleasant Bay towns, the towns of Chatham, Harwich, Brewster, and Orleans, they work together on a number of issues as the Pleasant Bay Alliance. They would like to move these bylaws forward, had applied for funding, didn't get it. We'll try a different way with them. And then Dennis, there's an ongoing conversation there. You may hear from Shannon Hulst later, as she lives in that town and is an advocate as the Cape's coastal floodplain specialist. So that's sort of the status of things at the present time, and I'm happy to take any questions. We had some great partners on this project through the two different grants, including the Urban Harbors Institute, Noble Wickersham and Hart, and the Woods Hole Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. We are going to take a few questions just for Heather and then move into our panel discussion with the larger group of all presenters and Shannon, who will be joining us virtually. I know there was one virtual question in the chat, but for now, what we can do is start with folks in the room. Any questions? Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Pallavi Mande from the MBTA. I was curious when you mentioned, the comfort that different towns have in terms of what they want to incorporate in their regulatory framework. And I'm glad that it was offered as a choice. But in terms of towns that have now gone ahead and taken this on, what are you finding in terms of folks who are resistant to sort of going with the higher vulnerability or preparing for the higher vulnerability? Is it just that they feel like it's a lot more resources that they have to be spending on planning for a more intense scenario, or?
I think they're concerned. I can't say exactly, but I do know that the development community is very active in this area, and there's always pushback on any regulation that might impact people's freedom to do what they would like to do. So I think the conversations had at the Conservation Commission level have really focused around what's our best strategy for moving the ball forward. We know probably our best strategy is to do this gradually. And, I think that we as I sort of outlined, we'd heard the desire for regulating these areas. So we developed a bylaw. We didn't necessarily think about at that time all of the challenges associated with taking on a new regulation and implementing it. So the way now with this suite of regulations and tools, communities have sort of more options to, how they're going to tackle it based on what they know about their community. They have existing bylaws. This is the other thing. So, like Chatham is probably the next town out of the gate to try to take this on. They have an existing bylaw that addresses floodplain development. So in some ways, for them, adopting regulations is probably the easiest step.
We do have a virtual question from Jamuna at BSC Group asking about the design guidelines that you showed on screen and kind of the self-sustainability of these guidelines, knowing that houses are built for long periods of time. In your view, how often should these plans or guidelines be updated and how to show financial benefits to residents?
Well, the guidelines are meant to be, they're non-regulatory. So they're meant as a tool for towns in their design review processes, which really vary across the Cape towns, how they incorporate design review. And they could be adopted as a regulation with, I think, some work, incorporated by reference. But the guidelines themselves consider different flood levels, really. So if you're in an area where you're expecting 2 feet of flooding, the design recommendations are very different from those areas where you're expecting 8 feet of flooding. And so I think as time goes on and flood levels change, you start to look at different parts of the design guidelines, if I'm understanding the question.
Okay, we have time for one more in-person question, and then we'll move into the panel. And can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Nathan Scott from Mass Energize. We are a statewide nonprofit organization helping communities engage. This is a question not so much about the regulatory framework, but more about how you did the communications. I just was online looking at, you have an impressive set of toolkits, communications toolkits that you referenced. I'd love to hear more about the experience of developing the toolkits, how effective they've been, what you've learned from the use of those toolkits.
Yeah, we started with developing a communications toolkit as part of our 208 planning process. So Section 208 of the Clean Water Act on Cape Cod, we spent several years developing an update to what we call our 208 plan, which addresses wastewater management on the Cape. And that was a huge effort. We needed to bring vast numbers of the voting public on board to get on board with funding wastewater management. The vast majority of the Cape is, wastewater is handled through septic systems. We need to move to sewers. People were not approving the funding for sewering at town meeting. So you get all this planning would happen and it would die. So the communications toolkit started with that. And some towns took it on and just found it to be hugely helpful in just having dispelling the rumors out there. It's very facts based. The facts are all available. It's put into language that the average human being can understand, and not the policy wonks or the people who are in it. So it was from that experience, seeing how useful that was in multiple towns. There was a clamor. We did it first for the town of Sandwich, and then other towns were like, wait a minute, we want one of those. And they were using it to help with their messaging. How exactly, I can't say. You'd have to talk to the individual towns. But some of it included like social media posts that, at that level. So we've used that initial model to build these other communication toolkits for our towns. And I can't speak exactly to how it may be used at the present time for this particular effort, but overall, they're highly recommend. I'm not, I guess I promote it because I don't come from a communications background. Maybe people who do, they're like, yeah, duh. But it's a how-to that's very practical and useful.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you very much.
At this time, we invite Joe, our moderator, to come up and invite all of our panelists to come on up to the table in the front. And we'll keep things going with the questions. I know Joe has a few to start things off. He's also going to introduce our panelists coming in from afar, Shannon.
Yep.
Welcome, Shannon. We can see you on the screen now.
Hi,
Hello,
Shannon. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to first introduce Shannon, then we'll move on to the panel. Shannon worked closely with Heather on these initiatives for the Cape Cod Commission, and she is the Barnstable County floodplain specialist and works closely with the Cape Cod Cooperative Extension and Woods Hole Sea Grant. She's a very long title, and that's indicative of all the things she does to help communities and businesses and homeowners across the Cape. So thanks for being with us, Shannon. I'm anticipating that and forgive the pun, am holding back a flood of questions for all of these great speakers. I'm going to start us off with one question for the panel to consider. What I was hearing in a lot of the presentations was, obviously we're working at a variety of scales, at a variety of jurisdictions, and often in places that have complications from home rule and tensions, if you will. I heard a lot that there was, I think a key to success was coordination and communication across those different levels of government and across communities to affect this type of regulatory change. Acknowledging that last week, Deanna was talking about initiatives at the state level for resilient coasts, and other initiatives through Mass Ready Act, as others are thinking about approaching regulatory change to incorporate future impacts and projections. I was curious if you could all share some lessons learned and strategies that are looking to make their own regulatory changes.
I guess starting with the county level, as I said, we're updating the regional policy plan, and it's really hard actually to engage the community in making regulatory changes. We do I'd say a big effort both through our newsletters, social media, and public meetings across the region. We make an effort of being in if not every community, though we make ourselves available when asked to be in a specific community, but at the sub-regional level to present the changes that are considered and make ourselves available for those questions. So I guess just as a sort of a starting point, we at the county level are trying to set the tone for these changes to regulations in the floodplain that hopefully then enables our partners at the local level to take those on and say, we're doing this at the county level. We want to do this here at the local level. We have resources that are shared. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
If I can add to what Heather said, if we keep it at the county level for a minute, we also worked a lot with town staff so that they were aware of the work that we were doing and had their input from those towns that were part of the grant process. So having staff know what we were up to and know what was coming out of it was really helpful. And then they also brought in some key appointed and some elected officials, mostly appointed at this point, but we've been meeting when we're meeting with the towns one-on-one, we're also meeting with various boards. Often it's the Conservation Commission, but also they're members of a Climate Action Network or a Coastal Resiliency Committee. It's motivated citizens, motivated volunteers who want to do something and also see that, okay, we have an option. We have an option for engagement here and to make a change. And so they get excited about, okay, we have something that we can run with. And they often also push this. And then I also had an opportunity to send it out to send the bylaws out to a few of the engineers that I work with regularly to get their feedback on, are you going to try to stop this when we go to the public with this, and got really positive feedback from that group as well. So really just trying to get it out there to everyone that we could.
So in tackling the intersections of the different levels of government, right? We have county, local, municipal, lots of boards and councils and commissions and all that good stuff. It doesn't matter, right? Don't confuse politicians with people and talk directly to people. It's hard, right? But it's the people, at least in our state, who are suffering from repeated flood events. And it's people who want and expect something to be done. And if what we are doing in pursuing this work, I've learned, because, I started doing this 6 years ago or 5 years ago in January 2020, we did what we always do as a regulatory body. We talked to the League of Municipalities and the Association of Counties and the Business and Industry Association and, every alphabet trade organization. And we forgot the people, right? And now all of those alphabet organizations don't see these issues the same way. Some of them outright oppose it. Others don't. But if you forget the people, all of the interests that may have, a perspective in one direction or the other, they sort of take the narrative and begin to steer the effort, and it gets away from you.
I'll jump on that. Just say, find your local advocate, and that person doesn't look the same town to town. It might be a road foreman. A lot of road foremans in Vermont actually know where the hardest hit places are. They know the budget implications of flooding. It might be your town clerk who's really trusted. And in Vermont, at least, we are not creative. Our generations past were not created. We name streets Water Street, River Street, Brook Street, less creative and true. There are flood streets in our towns. Like, go to those streets and talk to the people that live on them, because they're the ones that can tell their stories and move the needle.
Open it up to a question on the floor, and then we'll go to the virtual.
Sounds good. Who should I start with, Joe?
I think I saw Janet.
All right, Janet, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Janet Riley. I just recently started at Fuss & O'Neill, but I was a FEMA employee for many, many years. And so I'm curious about, with regulations, thinking about that carrot or the stick, and sort of different ideas about the approaches for how you can get more buy-in on regulations, and sort of that interplay between trying to reward and incentivize it versus trying to disincentivize what you don't want to happen.
I'm so sorry for the things I said about FEMA earlier. The scars are deep. I spoke a little bit about all of the different carrots that Vermont attempted for a very long time. They were 10% successful. And then at some point in time, I think Vermont finally realized, after each subsequent flood, that sometimes statewide regulation when it comes to public safety is the most important thing. And a stick is a stick is a stick. We needed it when carrots weren't working.
The regulations aren't a stick because it's the wise constraints that keep us free.
I'll jump in and add that with the bylaw work, I also manage the community rating system for our towns here on the Cape. So for those who are not familiar with it, it's a program within the National Flood Insurance Program. And in exchange for taking actions to improve flood safety, you get a discount on flood insurance. Excuse me, I turned off all my notifications and still one came on. So discounts on flood insurance in exchange for flood safety improvements. And the initiative for the zoning bylaw work that I had started many years ago was the CRS program. So it was designed in part around what you could get credit for in the CRS program, and that the National Flood Insurance Program put a priority on in terms of improving flood safety. So that's where it started. It's gone far beyond that. And once our towns do start adopting it, I will run it through the CRS program and see what kind of credit we can get. So there will be some incentive in that way. But for the most part, it's looking at the reality of what we're facing with this increased flooding, and not really, I guess I don't see it as a stick either. But hopefully we can put a little bit of incentive on it.
Great, thank you. So a stick becomes a carrot. Kyle, do we have any from the chat?
We do have a question from Nina on how you're each addressing a question on financing of neighborhood or district scale resiliency, just acknowledging the large amount of funding that's required for these projects, and there'll be needs beyond federal and state grants. A question on thinking about district or neighborhood or settlement scale financing. What's needed?
In the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, which is the benchmark coastal storm that affected New Jersey, that got us thinking a little bit differently for a little while. And in the aftermath of more recently Tropical Storm Ida in 2021, a number of studies were pursued with the Army Corps of Engineers, with FEMA as a local and state matter. I'll just give two quick examples. In New Jersey with a long Barrier Island system, right, stretches the majority of the coast. What we call our back bays, right, the stretch between multiple interconnected bays between the Barrier Islands that we've completely built out to within an inch of their lives, and our mainland. Huge tidal surge risk there. A study was done for built and nature-based solutions, stretching the majority of the length of the coast, the southern coast, and it cost $72 billion. $72 billion. And typically, the federal government would step in, right, and look at how we cost share something like that. Typically, the federal government would assume 65 to 75% of the cost, and the state would have to pick up the rest of $72 billion. We don't build our way out of this with flood barriers up and down our coasts, right? There's some combination of that and other solutions. But the financial burden of protecting everything is so great that you can't just rely on civil infrastructure to do the job. We've got to do it in lots of distributed small ways too, including through the type of regulatory reforms everyone's been discussing.
We're not so much in a position of identifying funding sources, but we are interested in how our communities will manage a major disaster and the aftermath of it. So it sort of gets to this question, I think. We'd like to put together, like to engage a specialist in municipal tax assessing or how taxes are distributed among the community between residences and businesses, the balance there, and what is the tax burden that is carried by our coastal properties versus properties that are inland, and how would that shift under a future under a post-disaster scenario. So we're still sort of working out the details of what are the right questions to ask here, but I think the idea is to better understand how our tax structure might work to incentivize development in the right places and not in the wrong places.
I think I'm the only poor state up here from like a tax burden perspective. So Vermont receives more money from the federal government historically than we've sent down to DC. Our internal finance capacity is extremely limited. Our economy is entirely based on tourism. Thank you everybody from Massachusetts in the room who likes to ski and look at our leaves. We love you. We also have great maple syrup. But really and truly, jokes aside, in a state like ours without real wealth capacity to kind of think of these financial incentives or structures at a local level, we have to actually start having really hard conversations about strategic retreat in our more rural areas and what it looks like and the actual cost burden of maintaining 4-mile-long dirt roads that service 2 homes, and the tax burden that has on the state writ large. And those are really hard conversations that towns and states don't like to have, but it's kind of where we're at now.
Thank you. Back to the room, Julie.
Thank you so much. I want to actually pick up on something you just said, Lauren, and something you said before, and Janet as well. Like there's this flip between incentives only, which we're also seeing sort of 10% in terms of our energy programs, people picking up incentives versus regs. There's this flip where you can do regs when the perceived benefits are at least equal to the perceived costs of doing the regs. You guys are all at the point of going from a one-time act of God to somewhat chronic damage. There's going to be a time when we'll have managed retreat or something where you're like, wow, the damage is too constant. Can you talk about your experience of that, like what causes that flip, both what you're experiencing already and what you think you would be doing once you really get into chronic damage?
I mean, I think that we're at a place of chronic damage, but it's like a slow burn chronic damage. One of the things that has expanded greatly in response to that slow burn chronic damage is our New Jersey Blue Acres program. And this is a program that is both where funding is federally sourced and state sourced to buy folks out of repeated damaged homes, but also we've now adapted it where you may have that repeated damage based on a future floodplain. And the program is oversubscribed, right? More people want buyouts than we can get to. And the frustration that causes at the local level is, you get a community that's in a bowl, you're buying out 200-300 homes, and the tax base is then collapsing in the town. There is then this push that happens at the local level to maybe not have those buyouts, right? Where the sort of, again, the political apparatus and the personal are just sort of not in sync. That's just one example, right? That feels like unmanaged retreat, which is, the third rail within the third rail of climate politics. And that, I tend to not speak about publicly because, people hate it, but it's a reality.
On the Cape, we're clearly seeing sunny day flooding. It's affecting roads. A project that Joe, or no, I guess it was Kyle mentioned when he introduced me, is our low-lying roads study, which we did across the Cape with whole group, was key in that analysis. Our DPW directors have seen roads flooded already, but what this study did was highlight those areas that will increasingly be flooded, and not just in storm events. And so people are beginning to tackle those, to take them on. And the community is very attuned to access issues. And I don't know whether this would be universally the case, but certainly on Cape Cod, where we have a much older population, people are, and as you go to into the outer Cape, in some places only one road. People are very attuned to, how do I get off of this place? How do I get to the hospital? So there's a lot of action related to addressing low-lying roads. And fortunately, there's state funding still for planning, at least, addressing those issues. As we had the meetings on the low-lying road project, some of those low-lying roads are in people's neighborhoods, and people could see some of the conceptual adaptation options that were presented, which would elevate the road, but wouldn't necessarily elevate their driveway or their home, which all of a sudden they are very, staring at the fact, oh, okay, wow. It's not just access, it's my home could be inundated, and how do I feel about that? So increasingly, and I'm sure Shannon could talk to this as well, people are calling up and asking, so I'm thinking of buying this property. What can you tell me about the flood risk? And I think people are beginning to make some decisions around buying properties, renovating properties if they already own them, and things like that. So I think we're going to begin to see shifts that are going to change the look of our communities.
Yeah. So Heather, where you just said, I get a lot of those calls of people, especially prospective buyers, saying, what is the risk of this property? Help me understand what this really means. I'm also starting to hear about insurance companies who are saying, we're homeowners insurance. We don't cover you for flood, but we are going to require you to bring your home into flood compliance if you want our homeowners insurance, even though we don't cover that because the risk is so significant. So that could end up being another significant driving factor. Another community that we work with while not on the Cape, Nantucket is really starting to experience a lot of these issues a little bit ahead of our Cape communities overall. So they are starting to address this. They are looking at adopting our bylaw. They also are starting to look at some hard infrastructure solutions for their roads that do flood regularly, but they've looked at lots of options of what's the best way to handle this. They've also had some retreat situations where less from flooding, more from erosion, where there's just no choice, but they're starting to look ahead at some access roads to 4 houses, just a handful of houses that are going to be either flooded or eroded. And to my knowledge, they're the first community that is actually starting to think about a retreat plan. They haven't gotten to doing that yet. I don't know if anyone from Nantucket is in the audience and could speak to this more, but they are ahead of us and really thinking about it. So we also try to keep in touch with them to understand what they're going through and what kind of pushback they're getting, and just keep up with what they're doing and take whatever lessons learned from them we can.
Thanks, Shannon. Any others in the room? Diane, I don't think we've heard from you yet.
Hi, Diane Moss from Fuss and O'Neill. I wanted to ask the panelists, where in all of this do you think there's an opportunity, or do you think there's an opportunity for the business community to get involved, whether that's, or what their role might be, whether that's industry and manufacturing that may still remain in, in those river corridors in Vermont, or in areas of New Jersey that are water dependent on the type of activities they do, or if it's more focused even towards, tourism as an industry. Is there a place for the business community to step up and be more active than they are? Just curious your thoughts on that. Is that an untapped area that we should be, as practitioners, leaning into more?
Well, without getting specific, I think yes. I mean, in any of this work, what I think the theme you've heard is the need to have leadership and champions, and to be thought leaders and move people's thinking away from the status quo. So, where we have projects that are proposing to develop on the coast, for the most part, that looks like redevelopment on Cape Cod. There aren't a lot of opportunities for new development. They should be doing the right thing, and being a model, and not trying to push the envelope and build more stuff in the wrong places. I mean, it's just, yeah. We need people to model good behavior.
I think there's also an opportunity for creative thinking here. I mean, we stay pretty well within kind of the confines of what we already know of elevation, keep a structure above the water, keep the water out of the structure. And there are, when you see design charrettes in different communities all across the country or all across the world, you start to see more innovative and creative thinking. And yes, the permitting of those things could be a really significant challenge, but I think there is an opportunity in this field with so much change that's going to have to happen moving forward, that there is an opportunity for creativity from the private sector.
I think the business community plays a necessary role. These risks are not risks to just people's individual properties and infrastructure. They're risks to assets that companies hold or may invest in. I think that an acknowledgement of those risks and organizing around them, and working collaboratively with those that are trying to address those risks in whatever iterative way that is occurring, wherever it is occurring. I think that that's a critical point, because I think what happens, or at least what I've seen, is the business community is not one thing, right? And there are multiple corporate and small business actors in my state that are already doing the right thing, or certainly would support the state pushing us further in the direction of doing the right thing. But when they're not organized and they're not vocal, there's this vacuum that gets filled by those who purport to speak for the business community. And often those interests will take an antagonistic view of any regulatory endeavor whatsoever, even the wise ones. And so it necessarily, to my mind, puts the business community in a difficult place, whichever subset of that community we're talking about, because what kind of steward of shareholder interest or of business assets are you if you're not planning for the future of that asset and how to protect it, whatever it is, whether it's a tourism asset, a manufacturing asset? You don't get to just stick your head in the sand, right? Not from a balance sheet perspective, an insurance perspective, or any other. And so the lack of engagement from certain sectors, I think that actually ends up being a disincentive to them.
Two quick things to add for a state, again, with very little by way of like business economy. Our economy depends on weather and climate. From our maple sugaring season, which is shifting pretty dramatically, to our fall foliage, which is still nice, but it's not great this year because of the drought, to our snowmaking ponds, which are becoming more and more important because we don't have the long, cold season that we used to have. Those businesses, a lot of them are on something called the Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility. They're less focused on the adaptation front, though they're doing a lot in that realm, but they are really focused in climate mitigation space to say, like, what can we do to slow this before our tourism economy goes belly up entirely because of all the impacts it'll take. Oh, and the other thing was, when I was a state hazard mitigation officer, I received a very strange phone call one day from somebody at Moody's Credit Rating who asked me to walk them through different components of our state hazard mitigation plan and a couple of regulations, or at that point, lack thereof. And after that call and a handful of others, it wasn't just me. We actually lost a point or a grade or whatever it was because of our lack of focus on climate adaptation as a state. So like the business, the economic forces are looking at this, and hopefully that will drive business interest and involvement and advocacy.
Kyle, do we have one more? Okay, stay in the room. Yeah, in the back.
Coming. Can you introduce yourself?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Bethany Tejan. I'm a PhD student at Tufts. My question is about regulations focused on retrofitting. We've heard a lot about sort of regulations focused on new developments, and I'm curious to hear from the panelists on sort of the unique challenges regarding retrofitting and adapting to climate change within existing infrastructure.
I can take a first crack at it. Cape Cod Commission does a lot of, we actually create incentives to redevelop existing structures. We'd rather see our historic structures reused in sensitive ways and not develop new land, but reuse existing buildings as much as possible. So this carries through to our proposed regulations that update the regional policy plan that create incentives to reuse structures that are within the floodplain, but disincentivize any expansion of footprint, intensity of use, new stormwater, new wastewater disposal flows, that kind of thing. So I think, again, as I touched on in my talk also, I think we have to move stepwise. It's really hard to just make a wholesale change that people can, get behind. Bit by bit is going to be the best strategy, so that we begin to demonstrate how you can improve flood resiliency in certain areas, and then we'll also begin to see structures leave the floodplain and increasingly not develop anything new in the floodplain. It's, step by step.
Yeah, right here.
I was just going to put my environmentalist hat on and attempt not to sound too Pollyanna, but retrofitting is a good question, especially for more heavily built environments. But at some point in time, we had to realize that like man-made problems don't always require man-made solutions, and that nature did a pretty damn good job of slowing and retaining water. And the more that we can retrofit those places, i.e. riparian buffer plantings to slow down water, making sure that we're protecting or restoring wetlands. Like if we can actually look at nature-based solutions as a tool in our retrofitting shed, we won't have, it's way cheaper A. B, we won't have to do so much to our housing and built environment stock. And then obviously a lot of great stuff. We were just talking about all the cool like green stormwater infrastructure projects just around this building and rain gardens. And like those are much cheaper solutions than like retrofitting regs.
I'll also jump in and say that of course, we'd love to see retrofitting, but of course, there's a cost to that. And so we don't want to require anyone have to retrofit because we, especially here on the Cape, we really have an affordable housing problem. So we don't want to push more people out. But I actually get a lot of calls that are saying, all right, I want to do something to protect my house because I'm seeing some flooding, but I can't afford to elevate it. What can I do? So more residences are starting to look into some sort of deployable flood barrier as an interim solution until either they can sell the place and somebody else can elevate it, or they can save enough money to elevate it themselves. So I'm starting to see more of those. I don't love recommending them for residential situations because they can fail. But I try to make sure people understand that, and it does seem like it's becoming a more popular interim solution.
Jess Walla with Niche again. I actually have a question. Maybe everybody would have answers, but Lauren, specifically a photo that you shared, and it plays off of what you were just saying. You had shared a photo with the river where it's kind of artificially straight and looked like there was a pretty wide roadway right on the bank of it. And multiple part question, is that common in your state where it's actually roads abutting it? And what kind of conversations and what kind of like successive have you had in terms of, are there conversations of changing alignments of those roads to restore more of the riverbank? And of course, there's houses on the other side of the road, and or elevating them maybe and restoring below. Just wondering, and where that responsibility would really lie in terms of towns or state and things like that.
Yeah, our roads are all up against our rivers and our railroads because of our steep slopes. Like the river valley was the only place where we could really develop, and so even in like tight little notches, you'll have a road right up against a stream and they get damaged all the time. We have a really progressive agency of transportation who is working very closely with our agency of natural resources. We actually had a very long battle with FEMA that was like very, very painful for a very long time. But we were the first in the country to require FEMA recognize our road standards, our road and bridge standards, to say, if this is damaged, previously FEMA would say, you have to replace it in kind with what was there. And we said, but our regulations require if something is damaged, you have to replace it to bank full width. That was like a 7-year battle, lots of flights down to DC and back. And it was something that was hard won. It was our stream alteration permit. So that was a really big change, but we're still, again, historic roads, logging roads, they berm up our river and force a lot of water down into our villages. And they continue to be a problem, but hopefully with strategic retreat of a lot of these roads and decommissioning of them and eventual upgrading of culverts and bridges, we'll have a more resilient infrastructure system.
A couple of months ago, might even be weeks, there was a kind of ordinary thunderstorm, and parts of the New Jersey Turnpike turned into a river. We're a long way from having our transportation system manage the stormwater, that exists, and it's a real point of pain. I'm envious of Vermont. We have the most drivers per square mile. And so in that storm in 2021 in Tropical Storm Ida, 30 people in New Jersey lost their lives. 26 of them drowned to death in their cars. So we're hardly there, and I'm very jealous.
Okay, well, I think that we're at time. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and Shannon, our additional panelists, for joining us today. Thank you all for coming. Need to invite Gabriela Basilio Santos up to the stage to close us out.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for inviting me up. I want to echo your thanks to all of our speakers and panelists today. Thank you to the chairs for planning such a great event and to everyone who made it possible. Thanks to all of you for being here right now and for your wonderful questions. As well, thank you, Foley Hog, for hosting us in this beautiful space, and to all of our supporters and all of our sponsors who make this programming possible. I want to let you know to save the date for our next forum, which is on December 12th. And we got a little preview about the conversation that we're going to have that day with some of the questions that got asked in the panel, specifically Julie's question. And not surprisingly, Julie is helping plan this next one. What comes next? Transformative adaptation. So we'll be talking about a lot of these aspects of like, well, you know, what happens when we have to go to plan B, and how is adaptation going to have to be different in the future? So save the date for that, and more information soon. And also I want to say, if you are in the room, you have a small little piece of paper on your table. That is a survey that we use the information a lot. So please fill it out. We take your recommendations and your opinions very seriously and change our planning based on them. If you are online, you are going to receive a link to be able to fill that in as well. So please take a moment to fill those out. And I think that's everything I'm supposed to tell you. So I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and thanks.